So let's get right to it. Let me introduce to you Robert Zimmerman. Robert, welcome to the Crossbreed Holster Studios. A real pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
It's been a wild ride, hasn't it?
Yeah, wild is an understatement, but definitely, yeah.
And I also want to mention that we have your attorney here as well, sitting to your left, and that's Jeff Dowdy. Jeff, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you so much for having us tonight, and just very, very thankful.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you guys here, and I'm proud to be able to bring your voice to America's airwaves today. Certainly not your first interview, not your first rodeo. You've done a lot of them. You do television. You do great television work. I've listened to a number of your interviews. One of the things that concerned me about the line of questions that you've gotten post-verdict has been the challenge afterwards. People tend to want to challenge you.
Right.
What people don't accept is the fact that the Florida courts have spoken. A verdict has been rendered, and under Florida law that I'm very familiar with as a former resident of Florida, your brother was found not guilty.
Correct.
The challenge part. How do you handle that? When somebody says to you, yeah, but, and they're working off of emotion and not fact.
Well, there's really two sides to that coin. I think the first is that the goalposts keep moving. Before, people were clamoring for charges to be filed, for an arrest to happen, despite there not being probable cause of any crime. They just wanted an arrest. Later, they got the arrest, and they wanted George Zimmerman, according to the Martin family attorneys, to have his fair day in court. And that's all they wanted. Then he had his fair day in court, and they called upon all of us to respect the verdict. And so did we. So did our family. Then the verdict came, and it seems it's not the verdict they like. So now the goalposts move again.
So the verdict's not being respected.
Right, obviously, yeah. Okay. I don't think so.
We don't hear a lot about your family, and I want to start from that position. I want people to feel and get to understand and get to know George a little bit. We hear a lot about Trayvon Martin's mother. The news is covering the Martin family, of course. The media is doing what the media is doing, and we'll go to that in just a little bit. You have a mother. George Zimmerman has a mother. And I don't hear your mother's voice out there that often. How is your family standing up to this incredible attack from the media, this unprecedented attack?
I think there's a couple reasons. In the beginning, there was an unfortunate vacuum. I think people should have heard from my parents or myself or maybe even George. But there were serious safety and security concerns, very serious concerns in the beginning. We vanished off of the face of the earth. All of us were displaced. All of us were in different stages of homelessness or hiding. And we moved many, many times. So that was what prevented us from kind of approaching the world in the beginning and rebutting some of these assertions that were being presented as fact. There's also health concerns. Our dad had just recovered from a heart attack. My mom takes care of her mother who has Alzheimer's. Getting their faces out there in the public was not in their best interest because it would end, in effect, any semblance of privacy that they had. And that's why I decided that it looks like I'm standing up for my brother. In a way, I certainly am. But at the time, the decision was to just stand up for the truth because George had told us all the truth, and he had told us all individually exactly what had happened. And truth is only defined in one way in our family. So people have heard from our parents now. They also have remorse at what happened, ultimately, that a life was lost. But they have serious considerations about their future that they have to take into account whenever they think about engaging any kind of media.
How old are your parents, if you don't mind my asking?
They're in their 60s.
Okay. Yeah, this is very rough. This has got to be very difficult. Let me go back. You mentioned about George telling the truth.
Right.
Was there ever any question in your mind, as a family, as a brother? Now, you're his older brother.
Correct.
Was there ever any doubt in your mind as to the story he was telling you?
Absolutely none whatsoever.
You didn't question anything?
Absolutely none. The only question in my mind was that the idea that he was so brutally attacked, it didn't sit well with me. I wished at the end of the day he did what he did to save his life. But I always wondered, why was the attack so prolonged? This is before we heard the 911 calls, before we heard him screaming, before we saw any photographs, before this was a case. This was just a brother recounting to me, my only brother, look, this is what happened. and this is how it happened. So there wasn't evidence, there wasn't proof, there was no court case. There was just a profoundly sad story that he recounted. And I think that unless you've heard him recount that story as a family member, you miss some of his sorrow, the pain that he had, the way that he was different. After this, I had seen him a few days before that when our father was discharged from the hospital in Florida. And he just was not the same. So there was no question in my mind he was telling the truth, because like I said before, truth is a central core value in our family. We don't have variations on how we define truth. Truth is truth, period.
Were there tears during that discussion?
There were when I thought that when my sister called me first and said that someone had died. And I said, our dad and our grandma had been in the hospital. I thought it was one of them. And was very concerned about that. But she said, no, it's not what you think. This has to do with George. So when he actually told me what happened, my sister had asked me, don't prompt him so much for details. Let him kind of get this off his chest on his own terms. It's very traumatic for him. He's really not himself. Let him just say what he has to say, and details will be forthcoming.
How did you get a phone call from him? I mean, how did all this come about? You got a phone call and said you're not going to believe what happened. I mean, tell us how that happened.
Right. First from my little sister. I was, doing dishes and stopped what I was doing and heard someone had died and just told her, please don't beat around the bush with me. If there's something I need to know, tell me.
Okay.
And she said that there had been some kind of event where someone had died, and I thought it was our family.
Right, of course. Okay.
Yeah. And then George called the next day, and he said. He told his story. He told me exactly what had happened.
Okay, now he didn't lawyer up. Jeff, let me go to you for just a second. He didn't lawyer up.
No, absolutely not. He cooperated with the police from the get-go. The moments right after the incident, he told the police everything that happened and continued to cooperate.
Smart move on his part. I mean, I know we're looking about this in hindsight, but is this advice you would give to somebody today in a situation like that where there was a shooting involved and somebody had passed away? When you want them to talk to the police without an attorney right out of the gate?
Well, typically not. You do not. But in this scenario, what Robert was just reiterating was that George didn't feel he did anything wrong.
Right.
He was acting in self-defense. He's a law-abiding citizen, and he cooperated with the police from the get-go. He went there the next day, walked them through it all.
I've seen those videos. Right. And I believe, Robert, and we have about 30 seconds before we get ready to take a break here. So what I'll do is I'll set this question up for you, and then when we come back from the break, you can answer it. I've seen those videos, and I think a lot of people who are looking at this case from an outside perspective probably haven't seen those videos.
Right.
Mm-hmm. They probably didn't listen to the evidence. They're listening to the mainstream media. They're being fed a boatload of lies, conjecture, and garbage. They refuse to accept the verdict, and in most cases, many of these people who are operating on emotion and not fact will never accept the verdict, regardless of the facts. And I'd like to get your comments on emotion versus fact when we come back from this break.
Great.
This is Armed American Radio live in the mobile Crossbreed Holster Studios. I'm Mark Walters, back after this with Robert Zimmerman. The Armed American Radio Network live in the mobile Crossbreed Holster Studios. I'm live in the studio today with George Zimmerman's brother, older brother Robert Zimmerman, and his attorney. Robert, welcome back to the studio. Pleasure to have you here.
Thanks.
And Jeff Dowdy,
yes,
your attorney, over here off to your left, and we're going to have a continuing great discussion here. A lot of areas we want to cover with you, and like I say, week after week, I wish you could hear the conversation in between the breaks a lot of times. It's fascinating, but it will lead us into this portion of the conversation. Next, I'll just turn the mic over to you.
Okay.
And let you pick up from where we left off.
Well, you were talking about some of the mythology versus some of the fact, and how that tends to elicit an emotional response when you pay attention to the mythology versus when you analyze fact. There's a saying in the news, if it bleeds, it leads, if it burns, it earns. And that's why the news these days is written with that kind of emotional hook to get people to tune in or read or log in or what have you. I think that one of the things about this verdict that struck me is that everyone was kind of waiting for the verdict, but I doubt that the number of people who were waiting with the verdict, with the intense interest they had in the outcome, actually paid attention to the process. Mm-hmm. We have a judicial system. We don't have a judicial answer in this country. So if you don't examine the evidence, if you don't follow the case, if you don't read some of the transcripts or look at some of the exhibits and do some of your own independent research before, during, and after, you just hear those two words, not guilty, and it may not make sense. But I would encourage people who are disturbed by the verdict or don't understand it to look back, to re-examine the actual process, not just in this case, but in every case, and to understand that court in our society is like a filter. It filters out mythology. It only admits truth. And it's the best system in the world for filtering out mythology and admitting truth.
Do you mean that we shouldn't base a jury verdict, Jeff, I'll turn this to you, on our feelings about something?
Well, you have to follow the law. That's what the jurors are supposed to do.
I'm
you heard
just
that
curious.
concept before?
I've heard a lot about that, and I've heard a lot of jurors out there just recently talking about how, and I quote, "We believed George Zimmerman got away with murder," and then in the same breath, "But the facts didn't show us that, and it couldn't be proven, so we had to find him not guilty." And I'm thinking to myself, what are you trying to say here? Is that an emotional response from a juror who renders a verdict and then after the fact?
That's a juror who, while I was in the jury room, followed Florida law.
Thank you.
And that's what the jurors have to do. Set aside all your emotions, leave them at the door, go in there and follow the law. And that's what that juror did. And it clearly was not guilty. And that's what she did. She followed the law. She might be having some remorse, but she knows in her heart she followed the law, because if she would have found him guilty or she would have hung out. But she didn't do that. She followed the law, and that's why George was not guilty.
Let's go back to the beginnings of this, Robert, with you and how this story you were telling us about getting a phone call from your sister and finding out there was a death. That's a tough enough phone call to get, and then to find out your brother was involved in a self-defense scenario like this. You knew your brother had a concealed carry permit, I'm sure. You knew your brother carried a firearm.
Sure.
Any training? Do you take any training that you're aware of?
George,
Yeah.
Florida law requires a class that trains you how to safely carry and when and only when to discharge your weapon, which is also part of some of the mythology out there.
It is, isn't it? And I want to get to Florida law with you in just a few minutes. A little bit of a leading question there. Back to you finding out what happened here. When the initial news reports, when the news first picked this up, and you saw this beginning to explode, what the hell was going through your family's head?
That there were three key terms that the media was repeating over and over and over again to get traction with this story. And they were repeating not just these three terms, but they were acting with incompetence, because the people they were obtaining their information from, the lawyers for Trayvon Martin's family, had a financial interest in shaping this narrative. And those three terms were white, black, and gated community. In every story, in every headline, whether it was, and then it evolved to white, self-appointed neighborhood watchman or white vigilante, shoots black child or black unarmed teen in gated community, in middle-class gated community. So there was a race angle, there was the weapons angle, and then it evolved into the socioeconomic angle, tying in that word gated to kind of elicit again some of those feelings as to why would this happen in a gated community.
Tell us about the community that George lived in over there. I assume he doesn't live there anymore. Tell us about that community. It's a very diverse community.
It is a very diverse community, and I think that some people are not really aware of some of the crime statistics. But crime statistics can be a little bit misleading, because you actually have to apprehend a suspect, charge them, and then get a conviction. Then you have a statistic for something that happened there. One of the things that's kind of disturbing about that community is, at least to me, it's a little unreal. That community had about 200 occupied homes or families in it, thereabouts. And in 1 year, they called the police, in 13 months more precisely, 400 times. So that means that everyone that lived there, regardless of their race or regardless of any of their ideologies, felt the need on average to call the police at least twice.
I know. The media meme here is that your brother was the one making all of these calls to the police because he was a, quote, wannabe cop.
Right.
What you're telling my audience right now is that residents called the police in this neighborhood over 400 times.
In 13 months,
yeah. 13 months.
That's pretty alarming, and the residents also were the ones who voted as to who should be their liaison, with the police department in Sanford, and who should be their neighborhood watch leader. And they voted for George. There is no self-appointment there.
Okay, I think that's an important. I'm going to go with you on this one, Jeff. That's very important. I don't think the people out there are getting the facts.
No,
George is a wannabe cop. George is a wannabe cop. People don't understand that he was, in fact, elected? Is elected the right word?
I think so. I mean, they voted.
Yeah, he's chosen at a homeowners association.
So he attended a homeowners association. So your brother was active in the homeowners association. He actually cared about where he lived.
Right.
Wow. When did that become un-American? I have to ask that. He's attended more homeowners association meetings than I have in my neighborhood, I can tell you that. And my community's not gated. I don't know what that says about me as far as the media is concerned. But let's go back to he attended the homeowners meeting. I assume he attended several homeowners meetings.
He did, and he was asked to be part of this. And it was the word wannabe cop really irks me because it's just a label that just was used to inflame everything, especially used by the prosecutor in this case. And I won't go up to speed to the trial, but when they use that word, wannabe cop, it's really derogatory because all it does is inflame the jury. And we had a call the other night on a radio station from a Sanford citizens on patrol who was proud. He'd worked for 20 years as a civil servant, doing it voluntarily, and he was just shocked. He was very disturbed by the remark, and I think you remember that, don't you?
Well, I do, and I clarified to that caller that Citizens on Patrol is a program that George was recommended for by Doris Singleton, the coordinator, and he turned it down. He did not want to be a Seminole County
I actually heard that interview. I was listening to that interview that you guys did down in Orlando. I believe it was on the American Adversary show.
Correct.
When that call came in. But I think we're getting ready to take a break again. Okay. So again, I'll set this question up because the wannabe cop thing. A couple questions that I've always had, and I've asked on my program. When did it become a problem to want to take care of your neighborhood and to volunteer your time, number one? And number two, when did it become not a noble thing to want to be a cop? Wow. That's a problem, isn't it?
Exactly.
When we come back, we'll continue this fascinating discussion. We'll dig even deeper into the life of Robert, his family, his mother and father, and George Zimmerman, and we'll get some legal advice from Jeff Dowdy here on the Armed American Radio Network when we return. Back to the Armed American Radio Network. I am Mark Walters. That was Mike Gallagher. We love Mike Gallagher. He's one of my favorite hosts. Shanto, down in Dallas, Texas. You've been awful quiet today, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing all right. How about yourself, Mark?
I'm doing wonderful. And I haven't had the opportunity yet to introduce you to Robert Zimmerman, who's here in the Mobile Crossbreed Holster Studios. Robert, my producer, Sean in Dallas.
Sean, nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Thanks for being on the show.
And Jeff Dowdy, your attorney, here in the Mobile Crossbreed Holster Studios as well. Jeff, my producer, Sean Shanto, as in Tonto.
As in Tonto. Nice to meet you, Sean.
Nice to meet you, too.
That was a moniker given to him by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, who we welcomed back from a break, and he said, "It's great to be with you guys, firing 44 caliber silver bullets of freedom across America's airways." So here we sit. Sean, I appreciate everything you're doing down there. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question and you want me to read it on the air, send me an email right now at mark@armedamericanradio.org, mark@armedamericanradio.org, and I will get to it within the next half hour. Feel free to send me an email. Again, that's mark@armedamericanradio.org. We'll go ahead and shut the phones down, Sean, because they will blow up. I'm sure you've probably already done that.
Yes, and I have Robert, I just want to let you know that you and your family are in my prayers.
Thank you.
It's, this whole thing, I'm sad to see it turn the way it has been. The court and the jury has spoken, and I knew he would be innocent even before, just because I've done a lot of research on the case myself, and so I know some of the facts that unfortunately the TV networks refuse to allow in there. So again, my heart and prayers are with you and your family.
Thank you, Shanto. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Shanto, I love it. It is absolutely beautiful. Let's go back to a line of questioning. Robert, I'll start with you again, and that is when the story first broke, you guys were probably sitting there in utter disbelief that you were seeing what, quite frankly, in my many years of writing stories like this and seeking stories like this out, this was a clear-cut vanilla case of self-defense in my eyes. And I've written now my second book on these topics.
Right.
I was shocked when I saw this. Now, I can't imagine what you as a family were going through, and particularly your brother, when he saw this blowing up, and all of a sudden, here's this guy whose face is everywhere now, not just on the news, but global news. He's on Russian TV. He's on television in China, and he's seeing this, and people are talking about him, and his character is at stake.
Right.
And they're not even looking into his character, another topic we can cover.
They just use the word white.
Thank you.
That was all we needed to know about George Zimmerman, is that he was white.
Again, the media pushing this meme, and we'll go there in just a second. But when the story broke and it became big, and it became bigger, and it became even bigger, we have NBC jump in the mix.
Right.
Now, George has told you a story about what happened.
Sure.
And here NBC plays a tape. Obviously, we find out after the fact it's doctored. What was going through your head, and how did he react?
I guess kind of the precursor to NBC playing the tape was us thinking as a family that once these tapes got out, George had told us he was screaming, and nobody came to help him. He told the police, I was screaming and screaming, and nobody would help me. That was his first utterance to law enforcement. We thought, finally, these tapes will come out. Now, it was the Martin family attorneys who sued to get them out, but at least when they're out, people will hear George screaming, and this will be over. It'll be an open and shut case. Instead, the opposite happened. At first, I guess Tracy Martin couldn't identify that as his son, and then he could, and then there were other reports about people not being able to clearly identify who George was, despite our dad going and identifying and swearing under affidavit that it was his son's voice. So we thought there would be some relief there, but then what NBC did, once they had those calls, is selectively edit a fairly well-documented exchange between George and the dispatcher into a statement, something to the effect of, there's a guy here, he's acting real suspicious, he's black. There was the white man calling out the black, and that was the necessary, those were the necessary ingredients to get the white versus black train, steamrolling ahead, full speed ahead. But others did it as well. CNN with those tapes, first a show called The Young Turks, but later CNN had their, alleged experts conclude conclusively that George was saying a racial slur. He was saying the word coon in the tape, which is just unbelievable because we just don't talk like that. That's something we may have read in literature from the 50s, but it's not something that we say. It's not something we use ever. Other networks like CBS joined in. They made these very misleading graphical representations of what had happened. They just had George walking down a sidewalk and some other individual and walking as well, and George just pulled out his gun and shot him, and celebrities joined on board. ABC more recently selectively edited the last juror that spoke out. Her name, she goes by Maddie. I believe she's juror B37, if I'm not mistaken. I'm sorry, B29. As saying that she had suggested that George Zimmerman had gotten away with murder, when in reality she was simply replying by repeating Robin Roberts' question to her, that she would tell those people that if you think George Zimmerman has gotten away with murder, you can't get away from God.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, you can actually read that story. You can go over to The Blaze. The story is titled, Did ABC News Deceptively Edit Zimmerman Juror's Controversial Interview? An Unlikely Source is calling them out, and read that for yourself. And we do have some questions coming in by email. We'll get to those later. The ABC, I actually was sent that by a regular contributor of the show, Sean. David Codria sent me that.
Yeah.
Absolutely irate that the media was at it again.
Oh, absolutely.
And Jeff, let's go to you on this,
Sure.
because you as an attorney, you see these falsehoods continuing to grow. You see edited tapes by NBC, and I asked a question in a previous broadcast. Wouldn't it be a kind of a strategy to have the jury hear something maybe they weren't supposed to hear, knowing the judge is going to strike it, but knowing that the jury already heard it? Isn't that what happens with NBC? Do they know maliciously that, hey, let's just do this? Somebody made this decision.
Oh, yeah, you do that quite often in the courtroom, but this was before we even got to the courtroom. And when that happened, it just exploded. I'm a criminal defense attorney right in Seminole County, right in Sanford, and it just exploded after that NBC report. And, the politicians got involved, and they basically shoved law enforcement aside, and it just escalated to pretty soon we were at Fort Mellon Park with Jesse Jackson speaking, and just creating more and more hatred towards George. And we hadn't even seen a courtroom yet.
Has Al Sharpton ever met your brother?
No.
Has Jesse Jackson ever met your brother?
No, he has not.
Has Al Sharpton or Jesse Jackson, or for that matter, President Obama, reached out to talk to your family?
Not that I'm aware of.
So
no.
You've got no voicemail messages and no phone calls from any of those people?
No, I should say, though, that NBC is in a particularly strange situation with Al Sharpton, because they have taken, under the guise of journalism, the approach of advocacy. That's what Al Sharpton does. But he's also touted as some kind of news anchor. And I think that's a very slippery slope. A lot of journalists will tell you the same thing. They avoid it. If you advocate, your journalism is ineffective. If you're trying to be objective as a journalist, you can't really advocate, so they're kind of incompatible. But I think NBC felt bound to the narrative that Al Sharpton was spinning, and he came. He's not rebutted. He's someone in our society that can say anything he wants.
Oh.
And no one can rebut him.
He has not apologized for the Tawana Brawley incident and the lives he damaged many, many years ago. And Sean, you know that as well.
Absolutely.
So please go ahead.
Well, he's responsible. To this day, this mythology seems to permeate that he, George, was told not to get out of his vehicle and defied police instructions. Well, you can strip that word for word from everything that I've seen from Al Sharpton here in Sanford. He started at community town hall meetings telling this to the public that, in defiance of the police, he got out of his truck and continued to follow. Unfortunately, people hear him. He knows that, and he says whatever he wants. It's a blatant lie. We know better now. If he didn't know at the time it was a lie, he certainly knows that today. Anyone with ears who hears that audio tape would know that. But, you're just not able to rebut certain people, I guess, in our society.
Well, clearly there's a political agenda at play here, and clearly these are masters of exploitation, of tragedy, to further their own political gain at the expense of, unfortunately, what you're finding out of someone else's life. And in this case, it's your family's, it's your brothers. Right. Armed American Radio continues after this. We'll go to Jeff Dowdy. I want to ask you some legal questions.
Sure.
Okay, and we want to talk about stand your ground, too, something that had nothing to do with the case, but sure is under attack. I'm Mark Walters. Armed American Radio continues right after this. To the mobile, Sean, the mobile Crossbreed Holster Studios. You got to love that, don't you?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Say it. Absolutely.
Well, my mic is so low, I can't.
My rental car is not a Prius, brother. I have to ask you this question because the story just recently broke about your brother saving a family, pulling them from a burning vehicle or an overturned SUV down in Orlando, Florida?
Yeah, it was overturned, and he suspected it might catch fire. He went with his...
Clearly, that was a setup, and clearly there was a production company involved with Universal Studios. How much did that cost you?
A lot of money.
It was an exorbitant fee, wasn't it?
Right.
I'm assuming that it was probably either the Disney Studios or Orlando or the Universal, which are right down the road. I know the area well. So you got Disney Studios on one side, Universal on the other, right?
Right, and it's a non-disclosure agreement, so I can't tell you.
Okay. All right. The fact of the matter is your brother saved a family. The family came forward, and unfortunately, I guess, I don't like to use the word chickened out, but got together as a family and decided your brother's too toxic. We don't want to say anything positive about George Zimmerman for fear.
I totally respect their decision. I can understand it completely. I mean, they had before they even came forward or attempted to come forward through George's attorney, Mark O'Mara, they had pictures of their children published online, and we've always been very clear to draw the line that, kids are off limits, but they had private family pictures posted. The nature of the media scared them, and I completely understand
and no question about it, particularly when they saw what was happening, and that's why they did. Have they said anything publicly since? I think they did issue a statement. Is anybody aware?
A very, very limited, right, through Mark O'Mara, who just clarified why they did not want to come on the air. It was
and confirming that, in fact, it was your brother.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Very good. Well, yeah, that's an amazing story, and to see the haters who just don't care about the facts at all come out and make those ludicrous comments that this was somehow staged and everything else. And Sean, you wanted to say something? I hear you jumping in there.
Yeah. Well, Robert, one thing I wanted to know, and I've heard this, your brother had done some things, for children that needed help and stuff like that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. There was
charity work.
Right. There was a community program that was funded, I believe it was through Seminole County. It's a mentoring program, and there's different ways in every community to volunteer, but George and his wife chose mentoring. The program was funded for between 8 and 11 months, something like that, but then the funding ran out, and you got a stipend. It was like, I don't know, it was like $40 a day or something like that for gas money to take these kids somewhere and do something positive with them every other week. And when the funding ran out, George decided that despite the lack of funding, he would take it upon himself, and so did Shelley, to continue to mentor these two African-American children. Their father is serving a life sentence in prison. And I think that it's a tremendous way to kind of break that cycle of incarceration. It's a problem I've heard of. It's been cited a lot about the African-American population being overly represented
Yes.
in incarceration. And I think that was one of the great ways to break the cycle. It's not something the mainstream media wants to talk about.
Yeah.
And protecting those children's identities. We got asked many times, who are the children? Can we see a picture? Anything. And of course, we'd never, ever release or disclose anything that would identify them. But it's
And
true.
I'm sure you've probably been called a liar about that from others.
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
You know.
No,
Yeah, it's incredible. Sean, go ahead.
I just wanted, because I had heard that, and I wanted to make sure that was out there, because, again, the media hasn't talked about that aspect of what type of man George is. He's a caring man, and he's trying to mentor, and that's something that we do need as men. And you know, if they don't have someone mentored me, because my father wasn't there, and that helped out a lot.
Wow.
Yeah, Sean, that's powerful. And you know, we can actually, that's a good topic of conversation. You guys can stick around for the next hour for a little bit?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much for that. I want to ask you about George, then I want to get to Stand Your Ground before this hour closes out. What was it like growing up with George? Was he a good kid or a bad kid?
I plead the fifth. No, he was good. We were very we were very close, but we always got annoyed when people confused us for the other brother. So if people called me George, I'd snap back. I'm not George. That's George. You know.
You guys look alike. I'll tell you that. There's a huge resemblance.
Right, and definitely he's put on a little weight since this whole thing happened. But before, when we were in the hospital with our grandma and our dad, the nurses there and the doctors would routinely confuse us. And one of us would spend the whole night, the next one would spend the whole day. They'd come in the next day and say, "What are you still doing here?" You know, and we'd have to explain to them, "No, that was my brother." And people just wouldn't believe it because they thought we were the same person. But yeah, we did everything as a team. You know, we served in church as a team. We went on retreats as a team. We went with our mother to do public or community service things like helping out with immigration and things like that as a team. We were routinely addressed as the boys growing up in Manassas, Virginia. And if you say the Zimmerman boys in Manassas, a lot of people will know who you're talking about.
Yeah, the story of your brother's character isn't coming out, and we want it to come out.
Absolutely.
We want you to have the opportunity to talk about that and give that perspective that the mainstream media simply, A, doesn't care about, isn't asking about, has no intention of asking about, and if they did, would probably lie about the conversation, as you well know now, unfortunately. But other than just normal stuff, no problems. He wasn't the type of kid get suspended and wasn't in a lot of trouble all the time, just normal kid stuff.
Yeah, to your point about the mainstream media, they looked for that. They did go to Manassas. They did go to our hometown. They ran me out of work by sending camera crews to all of the places that I had worked at looking for me. They looked up and down our street, our former employers, people that knew us, to find anything negative they could say about George. You know, and the pastor of the church we attended for our whole lives in Manassas called us generous people. You know, I'm not sure exactly what his words were, but leaders. Same thing with our mom. She worked for the courts. Our dad was a retired magistrate, and they looked far and wide to find anything out negative that they could about George. But as soon as they found the opposite was true, the reporting was done.
Well, that seems opposite, Jeff Dowdy, doesn't it, from some of the reporting on the Trayvon Martin side, doesn't it?
He was an altar boy.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
He was.
They're not reporting. Did they do the same thing? Do you know? Did they go to Trayvon's neighborhood? Did they go down to Miami? Did they dig into his background? Do you know?
I do not. I'm not aware of anything of that nature.
Eve, I don't know if they did. They wouldn't have. There's a lot of facts in this case that were never brought up.
Absolutely.
And that's something that I don't want to go into that right now. Time, too, of the essence. Let's talk about Stand Your Ground very quickly. And since we have you for another hour, we'll be able to get into some of these emails we're getting. I'm a little bit familiar with Florida law. Longtime resident of Florida.
Right.
And used a firearm. Didn't have to fire a shot in defense of my life before Stand Your Ground was law. But I'm very well aware of self-defense. Can you explain why Stand Your Ground is now a political hot-button issue in Florida when it was never a part of this case to begin with?
That just befuddles me. I don't understand that. As you know, Stand Your Ground is a law that was passed by Senator Simmons years ago, right here in Orlando. That's where he's from. And it says you don't have a duty to retreat. Stand Your Ground was not used in the Zimmerman case. Stand Your Ground would be a court hearing before the judge. And Mark O'Meara and Don West chose not to do that, probably because they didn't think the judge would grant it.
Right.
I mean, it was too politicized. This case was too politicized.
It was out of the bag.
There was no way Judge Nelson was going to grant it, in their opinion.
And they felt in that case, undoubtedly, that if it was denied, which they felt it probably would have been, that it could have been prejudicial to any juror.
And George would have to get up there and testify again. They already had all the videos that he did his interview.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, we're getting ready to close out here in just a second. We're gonna keep you guys here.
Sure.
We're gonna go to some emails, and maybe Sean will even open up a phone call or two. We'll check with you on that. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Mark Walters. You've been listening to the Armed American Radio Network, and I tell you this when I close out every hour, right about this time. Remember, carry on, carry often, and carry absolutely everywhere. Never leave your cave without your club. Don't be that unarmed caveman. More with Robert Zimmerman, George Zimmerman's brother, and his attorney, Jeff Dowdy, when Armed American the mobile Crossbreed Holster Studios. Shanto down in Dallas. How you doing? Is he still there? You know what? He had microphone problems. He's probably on the telephone right now, so we'll go back to him in just a little bit. I'm joined here in the mobile Crossbreed Holster Studios with special guests today. Robert Zimmerman, brother of George Zimmerman. Robert, it's a pleasure, and I really appreciate you staying over and continuing this conversation. Great to have you here.
My pleasure, thanks.
And your attorney, Jeff Dowdy. Jeff is sitting over to your left, right across from me here in the Crossbreed Holster Studios. Jeff, it's a pleasure. I've got so many questions for you guys. We're just going to go right into it. Hey, Shanto, before we get started, I got the following email.
All right.
Mark, if Shanto is from the Lone Ranger show, why can't he call you Amos Hobby? So that's a discussion. That's a discussion for another show. Yeah, we'll go there in just a minute. Ladies and gentlemen, I've got a ton of email here. I'm going to get to those in just a moment for Robert Zimmerman or Jeff Dowdy or myself. Please feel free to email your questions to me during the broadcast, and we'll get as many as we can here during this hour at mark@armedamericanradio.org. Mark at armedamericanradio.org. Wow. I'm not even sure where to start. We ended the last hour with the Stand Your Ground with you. And, of course, that's not a part of this case, and it never was a part of this case. I don't think it was a part of this case. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, it was not. It's self-defense. Everybody thinks Stand Your Ground was part of the case, but no.
Okay. Can you describe for listeners the difference between Stand Your... I want the facts out here. And, ladies and gentlemen, if you're one of those emotional, if you act on emotion and you have trouble thinking, please pay careful attention here. Let's think and not just feel. We want you to understand the facts. Jeff, would you describe the Stand Your Ground as it relates here in Florida?
Just in common law, Stand Your Ground is a statute in Florida that holds that a person does not have a duty to retreat if you are being attacked by somebody, and you can use reasonable methods to defend it, as opposed to and that's a statute. So if somebody, such in George's case, was acting in what we would call self-defense, but stand your ground, defending himself, there's no case. It ends right there. He's acting legally. Obviously, this didn't happen. So then what we had was a self-defense issue, and that's before a court of law. That's before a jury to decide. And we've had self-defense since the Old West days, since the colonial days. He drew first. We know that. That is self-defense, and that's the big distinction. Stand your ground. If it goes to a court and you're arrested and you stand your ground, you can go before a judge, and the judge can rule whether or not the person acted in what would be self-evident. It'd be self-defense, and that's pretty
outside the home.
Outside the home.
Outside the home, wherever you have a lawful right to be.
Right. That's definitely outside the home. That's what it's for. That's what the Stand Your Ground's for.
For those people who might have difficulty thinking and hearing and understanding what you're saying, let me set it up for you in very basic terms. I'm walking out of a Walmart. I have every right to be coming out of that Walmart at 2:30 in the morning to my vehicle. My vehicle might be one of maybe 15 cars in the parking lot, and I didn't park in a well-lighted area. I'm walking out of the Walmart to a dark area, and I'm attacked by 2 or 3 people, and I'm lawfully carrying a concealed firearm, and I've followed all the rules. I've taken all the required training, and I have my permit and my government permission slip.
All right.
And I'm attacked, and I'm backed against my vehicle, or I'm backed against a van sitting before I get to my vehicle.
Right.
I don't have to try to run away, do I?
No, you do not. That's the purpose of the law, and that's the name of the law. You can stand your ground, and you can defend yourself.
What is it that people don't understand about that? What is it about that aspect of self-defense that people don't get? Is it a political issue from different parts of the country where people have been brainwashed in New York for years that you have to run away, or we got to shoot him and drag him inside the house? Is that where this comes from?
It absolutely is where it's coming from. It's a simple law. It's a simple concept. And what irks me now is that Stand Your Ground had nothing to do with the trial. They could have had a stand your ground hearing, as I said earlier. I mean, but they just chose not to. So they went on a self-defense issue. So today, as we sit here, people across the country are saying this is a stand your ground issue. It's not.
And it never was.
It never was. This was a self-defense case.
I want to make that very clear, ladies and gentlemen. This had nothing to do with stand your ground. It was never a stand your ground case. In fact, I listened to Mark O'Mara. I met Mark O'Mara at the Gun Rights Policy Conference. Mark O'Mara's an old friend of mine. I met him down at the GRPC, the Gun Rights Policy Conference down in Orlando last year, and listened to him speak, and he made that comment at that time, that this was not a stand your ground case, but they may in fact look at a hearing because the law existed.
Exactly.
And of course that changed as the facts began to come out in the case, or I should say as the case became more politicized.
Yeah, and one of the things you said, Mark, that I just want to clarify, because I do get questions about this all the time. You said you were coming out of Walmart and you were attacked. The self-defense immunity statute provides a person acting lawfully in self-defense not to necessarily have to be attacked, but to simply be threatened. So if you were walking out and it's not well lit and someone pulls out a knife and says, I'm going to kill you, MFer, you can pull your gun out and shoot them. If that was a rubber knife, if that person was just kidding, if that person, thought you were somebody else or whatever, too bad. Am I correct?
Well, you're absolutely correct.
It has to be perceived as a threat, but it's not up to you in that instance to go examine the knife and see if it's really able to kill you or not, or if the person has the physical means or whatnot. So there seems to be misunderstanding in terms of being attacked or simply being threatened, and why that's so essential when we discuss stand your ground, because the duty to retreat is really what that addresses. It wasn't a factor in this case because George was laid on his back, unable to retreat to begin with. So there wasn't really retreat that had to be addressed. The other thing it addresses is civil liability. What would happen before is that someone would be found not guilty, or there was no separate hearing specifically under the Stand Your Ground statute that you could assert immunity criminally and also be awarded civil immunity. So someone would be found not guilty, and then they'd be dragged through civil court.
Correct.
To get money out of them, later.
And, of course, the Stand Your Ground law, which passed in Florida in 2005, correct me if I'm wrong, 2005.
Right, 2005.
October, I think it went in effect October 5th, 2005, if I'm not mistaken, addressed the civil liability portion of it, and it is found under Florida law. People need to understand this. This is Florida law. Mark O'Mara made it very clear in a post-verdict statement that if there were civil attempts to come after George from a civil standpoint, that they would, in fact, and this I'm quoting Mark, we would seek and we will get immunity for George Zimmerman. Now, I'm assuming at that point he would do what, since there's been an acquittal in self-defense? Would he go at stand your ground to go after the...
Yes. If the first line of defense, yes, would be stand your ground.
Okay, very good. All right, well, that hasn't happened yet. We don't know anything about that, so we won't address that. I got a couple emails here. This one comes in from Rob Morse. Rob says, Mark, how can the Zimmermans finally get their life back? Robert, his sister, their parents, George.
I do get asked that all the time. I don't think something's going to happen and then one day life will be normal. I think that clinging to our old definition of normal is kind of futile, but I think that it's a process. It's not going to just end one day, and it begins with re-engaging people when and as we feel safe. Right now, we're not there. There was a hate crime today in Washington where 3 blacks beat up a man who was white, screaming, "This is for Trayvon," and they stole his phone and his wallet. That's just the reality of a person who's walking while being white. There's still a lot of racial animosity circulating and permeating the verdict. So imagine what they would do to a member of the Zimmerman family, not just because they're black, but if people happen to be incensed or feel justified that Trayvon didn't receive justice, so now they're going to take it out on us. That certainly prevents us from meaningfully engaging anyone in the public right now.
And you need to be very, very cautious and very careful. I'm not telling you something you don't already know. That's something that was discussed before the interview and everything else, and I know that you're doing that. It's a shame that you have to do that. Sean?
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. That's absolutely appalling just to hear something like that.
Sean, do you know, and I know you're the news hound, you're counsel, we should probably have gotten Neil McCabe, our man on Capitol Hill, to check and find out when Al Sharpton is holding the rally in D.C. regarding that case.
I do not know, but I
He had a mini one. Yeah, he had a mini rally in Miami.
Yeah.
Just over the weekend.
Right, right. And he called for people to go outside of churches, I guess, on Saturday. And I think he wants, if it's not him, it's Jesse Jackson, I think, they want some kind of presence in front of federal courthouses going forward.
Yes.
Because they're now demanding
They're now demanding that Eric Holder or the Department of Justice charge George with violating Trayvon Martin's civil rights.
We call him Eric Withholder here.
Oh, okay.
By the way, for a very good reason. Obviously, the laughter means you know why.
Now,
go ahead, Sean.
I believe that, if my understanding is that was already done at the beginning before the actual trial, and the FBI had found that there were no civil rights violations whatsoever.
In fact, they found just the opposite.
That's correct. They said 100 agents down here interviewed hundreds of people and tried to dig up something where they could start a civil rights federal suit against George, and there was nothing there.
All right, well, let's
nothing has changed.
Let's go after that now. Let's
Sure.
go there. We'll just let the conversation flow. Forget the bullet points. How much time, Sean? Well, see, I'm a professional. That's very good. When you can sense that. Ladies and gentlemen, when we come back, we'll talk about Eric Withholder and the potential for civil rights charges against your brother, Robert. This is Armed American Radio. I'm Mark Walters. We'll be back. We're filling your prescription for freedom right here in the Crossbreed Holster to the mobile Crossbreed Holster Studios. I'm Mark Walters. This is Armed American Radio. We're filling your prescription for freedom today on the Armed American Radio Network. And, of course, we're talking with George Zimmerman's brother, Robert. Robert, welcome back to the studios. It's great to have you here. Thank you for sticking around an extra hour as well.
Thanks, Mark.
And your attorney, Jeff Dowdy. Jeff, you're here with us, and thank you very much. I know that you guys, there's a big demand on your time.
No
We
problem.
appreciate
Thanks a lot.
it. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
To give our national audience your perspective. And here we were talking about so many things during the break, I forgot where I was going to go with you when we got back. So what I'm going to do, if you remember what I said, ladies and gentlemen, send me an email at mark@armedamericanradio.org, and we'll get back to it.
Now, that's just funny, right?
Yeah, that is funny right there. That is.
We're live.
If it's live radio, what can I tell you? John Troutman writes in a little while ago to the studio. Little by little, the truth is coming out on news outlets such as this. Do you think this trickle of truth will eventually become a flood, thereby compelling mainstream media to report the truth, Robert?
My hope is that the next time race is injected into any story, especially something that deals with death or that alleges some kind of disparity in the way people are treated because of race, that the public will be demanding the media to be held accountable. I think race should send out a red flag, a big warning. When we inject black, white, gated community, we have to really listen with a grain of salt to what these people are feeding us. And I think that that's up to the public to demand accountability from the major outlets.
They should be incensed. And it doesn't matter what political stripe you come from, what your background is, when we've witnessed what we are continuing to witness now. Jeff, and the mainstream media is absolutely appalling.
Oh, it is. Well, just locally, just things got so out of proportion. And one of the victims that nobody talks about post-verdict, what about Chief Bill Lee?
Right. Oh, my gosh, yes. We've talked about him, yes.
And he lost his job over this because he made the correct decision. It was an unpopular decision, but he lost his whole career over this.
Well, let me ask you this. You bring up a great point. It was an unpopular decision, you said. Unpopular to who and when? Because under Florida law, and I've mentioned this on the air before in a previous couple shows, post-verdict, actually, he's been vindicated as a result. It wasn't just George.
Right.
That jury vindicated his decision as well. And now we got to go to Ed.
He's not the chief of police.
He's not the chief of police, but at least he has his integrity. And he knows that he was right. That jury spoke for him as well, too. Now,
Absolutely.
I don't know what ramifications he has. I don't know if there's anything.
I don't know if he does either, but he's a stellar officer. He's with Seminole County Sheriff's for 20-something years,
right,
and was only on the job for 6 months. He made the correct call, but he lost his job to politics. And you're right, his integrity has been vindicated. And locally, everyone's happy for him.
Right.
But the big picture, like Robert said, we have to step back and take a look at how we're going to publicize these type of cases. They just don't deserve this.
It's very sad. But with the state of today's media, literally a political propaganda arm, Robert, as far as I'm concerned, I don't see any light at the end of this tunnel at this point in time.
No.
This is getting worse and worse. The mainstream media has exposed themselves.
Right.
It used to be they hid their bias. At least they lied about it when you asked them about it. Today, it's wide open. And, any clear-thinking individual, again, I'm asking you, ladies and gentlemen, not to feel, but to think. And I know for a lot of you, that's tough to do. But if you can think, you can see the facts and you can cut through the phase.
Well, that's what the mainstream media, that's what they figured out. It's not really that they're in the business of informing people. It's that they're informing people how they should feel about something. And so they kind of craft and color the story, as it were, with their language, white, black, gated community. George is not white now, he never will be. Black was not a factor, and gated community, it wasn't Camelot, but people just hear those three words in one headline and any other words surrounding it, and the media is informing their feelings. It's a lot easier to do that. It's very easy to feel something about anything
of course,
than it is to have to analyze facts.
This is the playing on people's emotions. This was what Barack Obama's an expert at it.
Well,
this is exactly why they went after the Second Amendment issues. And this guy, Sean?
Yeah. Well, a lot of it, too, is we have people out there that don't understand the law. They didn't, and then a lot of stuff that you did get on the media. I was lucky enough, I watched the trial just unedited with no media. I don't want to hear what everybody wants. I want to see what's going on for myself, because that way I can make a determination of what was going on. But I think you have a lot of people out there that don't understand the law, and the media knows that, and they play to those that
of course they do.
Yeah.
Of course they do. We could do a whole program on how Barack Obama was reelected with the help from the mainstream media. Let's go to another email here. Is there a federal investigation? Will he get his gun back afterwards?
Presumably, the evidence will be returned to the authority who took or who had it initially, which is the Sanford Police Department or the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. The Justice Department has taken custody of all the evidence, including his gun. Mm-hmm. I would recommend to George, when I have that conversation with him, to destroy that gun in some way that's public, or some way that it becomes known that it's been destroyed publicly, probably through his attorney. I don't think I've gotten some strange emails about people trying to buy that gun. I think there's too much symbolism attached to that gun. It certainly has tragic connotations to it. So I think that gun, is probably better off destroyed. But he was entitled to get it back, but for the Justice Administration's continuing investigation.
And Florida law says he should get the gun back. Again, that's Florida law. Some people don't like that fact, Jeff, but it's the law that gun should have been returned to him immediately on the acquittal.
Judge Nelson, the judge said, return everything, you're free, no business with the court, and then the federal thing popped up, but I don't see that going forward.
Did Eric Withholder take possession of the nightstick, the Black Panther nightstick at the polling place when? Oh, he didn't investigate.
That I know of.
He didn't investigate that. I'm sorry, Sean. I was just, I don't know. I slipped for a minute. Yeah. I don't know what made me think that. It must have been the Fast and Furious investigation that made me think about.
Well, a justice person resigned because of the Black Panther thing. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a travesty what's going on. That's a whole different show. Let's go to Angela Corey. You had to be in your family. Let me at your mother when she hears this about her son.
Right.
He's been acquitted in a court of law. He's gone through hell. The family's gone through hell. Continues to go through hell. Your mother, in her 60s, is hiding in fear for her life. God bless her. And then to hear Angela Corey, the prosecutor, say, when asked, what are your thoughts? And she says, murderer.
Unbelievable.
Right.
Yeah.
My gosh, let me get your thoughts first, then we'll go to the legal perspective from Jeff. What in the world?
We grew up very close to a prosecutor and his family. We know and respect what a prosecutor is and what a prosecutor is not. Angela Corey said a range of things that were wildly inappropriate. And Angela Corey, in some of her relationships, like with Pam Bondi, the Attorney General of Florida, with the governor, my dad wrote a book that examines those relationships. It's called Zimmerman v. Florida. And I've never seen a better examination of the politicizing of what happened than what he's written in the book. It's a lot of research that has to be done to write something like that. But Angela Corey, in my view, if she wants to call my brother a murderer, I should be at least as entitled to call her unethical at best.
And great point. And when we come back, Jeff, we'll get your perspective from the legal aspect and the ethics of a prosecutor saying that after a verdict.
Right.
I'm Mark Walters. Armed American Radio continues. Listeners of the program over the last 2 weeks heard us bring a panel of self-defense experts. Robert Zimmerman in the studio here in the mobile Crossbreed Holster Studios. We brought a number of self-defense experts, and one of them was Massad Ayoob, who you may know. Massad Ayoob, of course, was listed as a
very smart guy,
expert witness, and was a consultant to Mark O'Mara on the defense. Didn't testify.
Right.
Didn't need to. Massad, very supportive of your brother and the actions that your brother took based on the facts
of the law,
as he was presented to them by counsel he read every page of discovery. We're going to go to whether or not they got all of that discovery, Jeff.
Right.
So let's phrase this question with this. The governor. I made the statement publicly on the air here last week or 2 weeks ago that I was very disappointed in Florida Governor Scott for not listening to, or bowing to, I should say, political pressure from the likes of Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson. Clearly, there was tremendous political pressure brought down to bear on him when Obama made the comments. Like him or not, he's the president of the United States, and he knows whether there were aliens in New Mexico. We don't. The fact of the matter is that he was under tremendous political pressure, and I get that. Was your family disappointed when the governor appointed that prosecutor? You had to know the results of what that was going to be at that point in time after he took over and appointed outside prosecutors to look at the case.
Actually, I mean, you mentioned Obama. We were clearly disappointed when we heard the "if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon" remark, because that, to me, deals, I understand it suggests empathy, but it really injects race, and that's something we were not willing to do. We weren't willing to correct the record by saying, wait, George is Hispanic, please don't call him white. Injecting race in anything is a disservice to all of us. It really, unless it's absolutely specifically a proven factor, can't just be alleged without anything to support it, and we all just kind of run with it. Now, after he said that, I wonder how tied the governor's hands must have felt to do something. I know that the statute here provides for the governor to replace, in the interest of the perception of justice, a state attorney with another one. When the state attorney who's handling the case either requests it or not, so the governor can simply just overrule them and send another one in. I don't think we had any expectations at the time, in particular, of what Ms. Corey would do. We started to learn more about her as time went on and about some of the more controversial things she's done in her district. And we started to learn from a website called theconservativetreehouse.com about some of the connections that she has to Pam Bondi.
Right.
Some of the things Pam Bondi was saying on CNN were very controversial as well. Some of the things that the governor could have messaged a different way were not resonating as well. Ultimately, she made the wrong call. She charged him with a crime when no crime was committed. But I don't think that we had the expectation. Like I said, we grew up very close to a prosecutor and his family, and we understand what a prosecutor is and what their job is. Their job is not riot control, as Alan Dershowitz put it. That's not the job of a prosecutor, nor is it to seek justice for this person or that person, but it's to seek justice based on the truth, based on the facts of law for society at large. So I don't think we had an expectation. Were we disappointed? Absolutely.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I was disappointed. I'll be very honest with you. Like you, I was disappointed when I saw that come down. As an attorney, let's get your perspective on what you thought the governor did, right or wrong, and then afterwards, let me just let you run with the mic, Angela, Corey, and some of the allegations now about her and the discovery and so forth.
Well, I've worked with Norm Wolfinger. He was the state attorney in Seminole County for 25 years, and he's a great man, reputable man, never had any problems whatsoever, and he made the decision that charges were not going to be filed. And it comes from Chris Serino from Sanford Police Department, who I've done many murder trials with. That was the decision. And then it started getting politicized, and it just snowballed, and I know it got bounced to R.J. Larissa. He was the Volusia County 7th Circuit State Attorney, and he didn't take it, and somehow it got up to Miss Corey's office. I don't know how. I wasn't in Tallahassee, but Norm Wolfinger made the decision that it was not going to be filed on. And how it got politicized, I don't know. Now, as far as Corey's office, where she handled what we have in Florida is called an open book discovery. And what that means is when you have a criminal case, she made a decision to file charges, so she has to turn over all the evidence that she has. And this was the major sticking point in this case, that she withheld evidence. It was brought to her attention particularly about this cell phone that had what we call exculpatory evidence, evidence that would help the defense. She had it in January. It was brought to her attention by the IT worker from her office who told her that they did not give everything to Mr. O'Mara and Mr. West. And like I said before, I've worked with these guys for years, and they're very reputable attorneys. They didn't turn that over till June, 3 weeks before the trial, and they finally turned over this evidence that would help their defense. At that time, the defense asked for a continuance because we just got this, thousands of pages of discovery, and they were denied. So they had 3 weeks to prepare, and they still never got it into evidence. But those type of things are just plain wrong. The state attorney's office is out there to seek justice. They're out there to seek justice for everybody. They're not supposed to hide evidence. They're not supposed to violate discovery rules. And there's sanctions hearings coming up, and we'll see. But the way that the case was handled just is reprehensible. And in the words of Don West, and I agree with him, he's a good friend of mine, and like I said, I've done a lot of trials with him. But it should have been an open book discovery, especially a case on the national level, international level. You turn over everything and let it fall how it does. And it was just wrong the way it transpired.
Some of that material is now coming out.
Some of it. One of the investigators that Jeff mentioned, Mr. Serino, Detective Serino, hired an attorney because he thought that Brady material had been not turned over, and Brady material is material that can be exculpatory and is relevant to showing the guilt or innocence of the accused.
That's from a landmark case.
Right.
Brady versus Maryland. It's called Brady material, and he's right. And Chris Serino, I've worked many murder cases with him. He's an upstanding guy. And as you just said, he had to get his own attorney.
Right. Ben Kruidbos, an employee that worked, I should say, before he was rather in a very bizarre way discharged of his post. He was the IT director for the Fourth Circuit. He was afraid that all these things that he was uncovering, this digital material from cell phones, was not getting turned over to the defense. I mean, even he knew enough to know that could be a potential discovery violation. He lawyered up, and he got fired for whistleblowing.
You haven't heard the end of that one.
No, I wanted to ask you that. We're reading each other's minds. It's nice to have you here when we're not on the phone. We can actually sit and look at each other, and I saw the reaction on your face, and I go ahead and run with that one.
Well, I mean, he was fired. He's a whistleblower, and he was fired. And there's laws that do that. You've not heard the end of that. He'll file a suit for wrongful termination, and he's, in my opinion, 100% right.
What does that say about Angela Corey, and can that be used in any future?
It could, but who knows? Who knows?
It makes me wonder how many people are incarcerated today unlawfully, unethically at best. How many people has she used these, what I see as hide-the-ball tactics, legal maneuvering, what photo? I don't know what photo you're talking about, that the officer had the night of. Withholding evidence because it's digital and they'll never know the better. Things like that. If it's proven, if that's what happens, I wonder how many people are right now in prison because of her tactics.
Yeah, Angela Corey, I guess, if you're out there listening somewhere, we know this ain't your first rodeo. This ain't the first time that's happened. It's terrible. And to think, and here again, we're talking about your family, and I'm being told we're getting ready to go to a break. The last segment coming up, I want to ask you a question about how, in your mind, how that evening unfolded, based on the conversations that you've clearly had with your brother. And then I want to ask you a hypothetical question, but one that I think will elicit a response from you that will give us an indication as to whether or not, again, this should have ever even been charged. And I want to make that comparison.
Okay, great.
When we come back here on the Armed American Radio Network. I'm Mark Walters, filling your prescription for freedom coast to coast across America. We're talking with Robert Zimmerman, George Zimmerman's brother, and his attorney, Jeff Dowdy. Back right after this. We're in the last segment, and these gentlemen have been kind enough to stay in the Mobile Crossbreed Studios with us for an extra hour, and we appreciate that very much. Robert Zimmerman, welcome back.
Thanks, Mark.
A pleasure. Thank you very much. I hope you'll come back on the show again in the near future.
I hope so as well.
You'll definitely be invited. And Jeff Dowdy, thank you very much for staying here with us for the hour.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Mark.
We're going to have to move quickly. Time flies. Let's go to prosecution. There's a lot of theories about whether or not your brother was over-prosecuted, and you can hear both sides of that. He was over-prosecuted because the prosecution knew they wouldn't get second degree, and they were hoping for a manslaughter conviction out of the jury, number one. Number two, there's that conspiracy theory that he was over-prosecuted simply because they knew they didn't have a case, and they had to do something because of the political pressure that was brought to bear by some of America's haters, and we all know who we're talking about.
Right.
Your thoughts on that and your family's thoughts on that, and your brother's?
Actually, for those kinds of questions, I defer, and I hate to plug again my dad, but he really wrote an excellent book, and I'm reading about this individual, Martin Lee Anderson. This was no accident that this child was killed, Assistant State Attorney Pam Bondi told jurors. Martin Lee Anderson died in a intensive boot camp for youth,
right.
And there was a big racial firestorm made up at the time, and this is where the Crump, Jackson, Natalie Jackson. But the Crump, Darrell Parks Jackson script or playbook, their business model was born then. And Miss Bondi has gone out on the record giving accolades to Miss Corey, saying that she's responsible for, what she is today. And Miss Bondi goes out of her way to praise Benjamin Crump as well.
I want to point out to listeners across the country that Pam Bondi, who Robert is referring to, is Florida's Attorney General.
Right, she is now. Right, yeah. And there's been a lot of, wrangling right at the top. And I think that as this suit goes on with Mr. Kroidbos, any other action the legislature may take against Miss Corey, it's going to uncover a lot more about what were the marching orders from the governor's office? What were the marching orders from Pam Bondi? Was this simply just to come down here and investigate? Because you talked about the overcharging. That is a tactic sometimes. It's a tactic used to get people to take a plea most of the time. But I think that they just made a political calculation that they had nothing to lose. At worst, they thought they would be seen as people who tried and lost. Better than that was, hey, it's a manslaughter conviction and we did the right thing, And of course, the top prize would have been a murder conviction. Unfortunately, charging George with any crime after the officials here locally had determined repeatedly there was no crime committed damaged the public trust in their officials. It was a disservice to Sanford ultimately.
Did your brother know, and maybe you don't know the answer to this question, I'm assuming that you've spoken to him about it. Did he know when the special prosecutor was brought in by the governor? Did he feel he was going to be charged at that point with all of everything in the news?
I didn't speak to him about the special prosecutor being brought in. I spoke to him after the special prosecutor had been brought in. Right. So, he knew that this stuff was going on. He wasn't living in some kind of vacuum, but he wasn't hiding. I think he would probably tend to think about prosecutors the same way our family does. Okay. They don't just seek justice for Trayvon, or they don't just say someone died, let's charge with murder.
His faith was in the system. What you're telling me is his faith was in the system.
From the beginning, from not lawyering up and telling the truth and not hiring an attorney and cooperating with police, is and has always been in the system, and so has our families.
Now, your father is a what?
Retired Virginia magistrate.
Okay, so you guys know a little bit about the law. You know a little bit about criminal justice. He grew up in that environment.
Well, we certainly know what probable cause is.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Very well put. Very well said. Jeff, let me go over to you now with the legal theories here of the over prosecution. Your thoughts on that?
It's typical, and Robert's right. Sometimes it's there to try to get a plea. Listen, I'll let your client plead to a lesser charge. A lot of times you'll have death penalty cases that'll get. Listen, I'll give your person a life sentence. If they want to plead guilty, we'll waive the death penalty. But it's also, I think in this case, though, it was more political. They knew the evidence that they had. I don't think they knew they could get a second-degree murder, but they could try to get a manslaughter, and that would be a lesser-included charge. Don West vehemently argued against a lesser-included charge, so did Mark O'Meara. They wanted second-degree murder. That's it. Let's go on that. That's what you charge.
Standard procedure for the judge to do what she did and allow that?
Yeah, she was obligated to do it. Yeah, it was a correct decision, and so they got the lesser charge, and a lot of people thought he might get hung on that. Right. You could tell with the way the prosecution laid out the case, they were laying out evidence that some people were in the legal community were like, what are you doing? They weren't like really aggressively prosecuting. They did give out a lot of evidence, like, why'd you call this witness?
Well, I watched it. I thought the same thing. I thought, this is the prosecution's witness here.
And I think that was more of a political atmosphere to say if they lost the case, they could go out on a podium and say, ladies and gentlemen, this is what we have. We gave every bit of evidence that we have, but for the cell phone. And this is what happened.
Wow, we start interjecting politics into this, and we've got just a mess on our hands. Yeah. When you combine that with the mainstream media that is clearly pushing an agenda, it's impossible to get to the facts.
Right, and I think Robert's absolutely correct. When somebody started second-guessing Norm Wolfinger's office, which he is a spectacular reputation in the community, when they started second-guessing them and bringing in outsiders and it started getting politicized, and I knew in the legal community, because I'm there in the trenches every day, when they got a special prosecutor, we all knew charges were coming.
And I hope he knows that it wasn't the legal community and his peers and colleagues that was second-guessing him. Right. It was Al Sharpton, it was Jesse Jackson, and it was the mainstream media that was second-guessing. Right. Because they were pushing a political agenda, and we all know that to be the case. Right. Robert, I have to ask you this. When it was offered manslaughter, did your knees buckle? What did your mom think? And what did your brother think? Was he scared to death?
Well, we expected that lesser included. It usually automatically, I think, is
Category 8 necessarily included offense.
Right.
They had to give it. Even though they argued, unless the parties agreed to it and stipulate, she had to give it.
Right, right. Now they did try to argue for child abuse and committing child abuse with a firearm that resulted in a death, which are some kind of like add-on charges as well. But I think the moment of knee buckling was when the jury wanted additional instructions to define manslaughter.
Right.
That was a little bit bizarre. At least it kind of indicated that murder might be off the table. But that was our worst fear, is that the instructions, the self-defense instructions, would not be clear enough, or that people, just lay people, when someone dies, it's really a homicide, but most people in this CSI generation in Law and Order think, oh, well, that's a manslaughter because one caused the death of another, and now that one is that person is dead.
Like probably you and Jeff probably as well as you, and then probably George and your family and everybody else. The political pundits, the moment they ask that question,
they were all over it.
They're coming back with a manslaughter. They knew what was happening. We're going to come back. Oh, they're clearly going to come back. You had all the pretty attorneys on Fox News, all the TV lawyers out there telling everybody that this is what this means. This is what's going to happen. And yet again, they were all wrong.
Exactly.
They were all wrong, ladies and gentlemen. You've got to look at the facts. Quit listening to these people on TV. Very quickly, we're getting ready to end the show. We've got about 10 seconds apiece. If Trayvon Martin had lived and not been killed, would we even be here today?
Hard to tell. Probably not.
Jeff?
Probably not. It wouldn't have got politicized.
And without the politics involved, we wouldn't be having this discussion, would we?
I think
you're right.
And your brother wouldn't have been persecuted.
I think it would have been
political persecution.
It would have been pegged as an attack was stopped, but not a black person died at the hands of a white person.
I want to thank both of you gentlemen for coming here. You're going to be invited back very soon. I appreciate it very much. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to Robert Zimmerman, George Zimmerman's brother, and his attorney, Jeff Dowdy, here in the Armed American Radio Crossbreed Holster Mobile Studios.